Hi, welcome back, folks. Today we're going to start talking about federalism. So first of all, we'll talk about what is federalism. And the short answer is that I'm not going to answer that part of the question here. I'm going to direct you to Web Campus, where I've put up Dr. Patterson's video and a couple of other refreshers to talk about what federalism actually is. It's important to remember, though, this is an innovative government structure that was unique to the American experience, born out of the necessity of taking a bunch of existing sovereign entities and creating sort of a superstructure government over top of them. So in terms of American federalism, there are very different conceptions about what this actually means in practice. And we can understand some of those differences by thinking about different understandings of who the parties are to the agreement that we see in the Constitution. So some folks believe that the federal Constitution is an agreement between the federal government and the states. So an example of this is from James Madison's Virginia Resolution. And he says the states who are parties to the contract have the right and are in duty bound to interpose for arresting the process of the evil and for maintaining within their respective limits the authorities, rights, and liberties appertaining to them. So this is the idea that the state governments are the main parties to the Constitution as an agreement with the federal government. And so here you see an emphasis on 10th Amendment principles, this idea that the states are the primary interlocutors with the federal government. But we also see folks who would argue that this agreement is actually between the federal government and the people directly. So an example of this here is Justice Story in his Martin versus Hunter's Lessee opinion. And he says, the Constitution of the United States was ordained and established not by the state in their sovereign capacities, but emphatically, as the preamble of the Constitution declares, by the people of the United States. The Constitution was not therefore necessarily carved out of existing state sovereignties, nor a surrender of powers already existing in state institutions. So here we see an emphasis on the principles of the necessary and proper clause, the idea that the states aren't the main partners to the federal government in this agreement, but instead this is an agreement between the people and the federal government. So we're going to see this echoed in the kinds of federalism or the flavors of federalism that we tend to cycle between over the course of American history. And so the first flavor is dual federalism, and this is often represented by a layer cake. And I've chosen a two-layer cake to represent the two main sovereign entities. Now sometimes you'll see this represented as a three-layer cake with local governments on the bottom. I decline to do that here because the local governments aren't actually sovereign. The local governments get their authority directly from the state governments, but then dual federalism would have the state governments and the federal government having different sources of sovereignty and also having different roles that are sort of separated by a tasty little layer of icing. You can compare this to cooperative federalism, which has been represented by marble cake, which is also delicious, I think. And here you can see that there are two layers of government, and their duties are sort of enmeshed in one another. And so we're going to see in the text, and certainly in our discussion in this video, and then some of the discussions later on in the videos about the commerce power, we're going to see how throughout history we've kind of gone back and forth between these two ideas. So one of the first key cases about federalism is McCulloch versus Maryland. And you'll remember that we've already talked about this case when we talked about the powers of Congress. And so you'll recall the material facts here. This is about the Second Bank of the United States, and it's just a mess. There's all sorts of corruption and It's losing money, it's mismanaged, it's awful. And so a bunch of states are really irritated about this, and Maryland, along with a couple of other states, actually tried to tax the bank in order to get it to move somewhere else. And so the legal questions, the first one, of course, was whether Congress has the authority to establish the bank, and we dealt with that in an earlier session. But then the second question was whether Maryland could actually tax the bank. So the holding here, this was a unanimous decision written by Chief Justice Marshall, and the answers here are yes and no. And we did the first one earlier in the semester, but the second part, the main rationale that we see in this opinion involves this really interesting and famous quote: "The power to tax involves the power to destroy." So the idea here is that the state government does not have the power to tax institutions of the federal government, because that also includes or involves this power to destroy that government. And so you see in that excerpt of the opinion, you see Justice Marshall talking about, it might not be that big of a deal to from one state to tax this one bank. But if you allow this, and then, sort of following this along its trajectory, allow other states to tax other entities of the federal government, pretty soon you're going to tax the federal government out of its ability to actually provide what it is supposed to provide. And so, so this is where we see this limitation on the ability of states to assert that level of sovereignty. And now we're going to move forward to what is probably one of the very worst decisions in the Supreme Court's history. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that. I don't think it's a terribly controversial statement. This is Scott versus Sanford. And I will warn you that this is going to include some awful language about enslaved people, awful racist language. So the material facts had to do with an enslaved person named Dred Scott, and he had lived in numerous different places, including in a free state and in a territory that the Missouri Compromise had specified would be a free state instead of a slave state. And so Dred Scott sued in Missouri, and Missouri said that he didn't have jurisdiction because he was not a citizen of the state. And then he moved so that he'd be able to sue in federal court under the diversity jurisdiction. And so the legal question here is whether Dred Scott can sue in federal court under the diversity jurisdiction. Now you'll notice that this is the only legal question that's really posed, even though the court decides to go much further than this. So the holding is 7-2, and the answer to this question is no, Dred Scott cannot sue in federal court under diversity jurisdiction, and they go on to make a kind of opine about a whole bunch of other legal questions. So Chief Justice Taney wrote the opinion for the court, and his rationale was that Dred Scott is not a U.S. citizen, and he can't possibly be because he is Black. And he goes on to say that he's clearly not a citizen of the state of Missouri because the state of Missouri has just declined to say he's a citizen. But he did live in a free state, which is Illinois. And so Taney said that even if Illinois wants to let him be a citizen there, this does not make him a citizen of the United States. And this means that he can't sue in federal court. Now, this probably should have been the end of it, because this would mean if he can't sue in federal court, well, the Supreme Court is a federal court, and so this would mean that the court would say, he doesn't have standing, he can't sue, and so now we're done. But instead, the court goes on to include some additional opinions in dicta. Now, dicta is short for obiter dicta, and what this means is these are additional arguments that the court makes beyond the scope of what it has to make in order to reach the decision that it needs to reach in the case before it. Okay, so this wouldn't necessarily be binding, but it is still presented in the opinion. So Taney goes on to argue that Congress does not have the power to regulate slavery in new territories that were not territories at the time the Constitution was written. And what this means is that the Missouri Compromise is also unconstitutional. And, I say not they have jurisdiction over this, but they decide to commit this to paper anyway. And perhaps one of the most infamous lines in this opinion is this section where Justice Taney is talking about why he is so certain that Black people, no matter whether they had been enslaved or not, could not possibly be U.S. citizens. And the language here is shocking, and I would say it was probably shocking to some people even at the time. They had, for more than a century before, been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. So this is actually a direct quote from an opinion of the United States Supreme Court. Now, there were dissenters in this case. There were two dissents. The first one, Justice Curtis, this is one that was excerpted in your book. And so Curtis focuses here on the citizenship question. He says, every free person born on the soil of a state who is a citizen of that state by force of its constitution or laws is also a citizen of the United States. So he's taking issue with this argument that somehow you could be a citizen of a state and then not be a citizen of the federal government. He also lays out this really interesting argument that, look, there were Black people in America who were free, and they were citizens in some states under the Articles of Confederation. What this means is that they were citizens during the process of ratifying the Constitution. So they were part of this group of people. They were part of the group of citizens ratifying this instrument. And so he says it would be very, very strange if the Constitution that these people ratified stripped those very people of their own citizenship. So he dissents on this citizenship question completely. Now, McLean also has a dissenting opinion. And his dissenting opinion, I think, is a little subtle, but it is also a pretty strong dig at some of the racist language in the majority opinion. So he says, in the argument, it was said that a colored citizen would not be an agreeable member of society. This is more a matter of taste than of law. So essentially what he's doing here is he's calling out this idea that somehow, because there are people who have been conditioned to these racist ideas about who should and shouldn't be a citizen, that these are not rooted in law, that this is just racist. Of course, it doesn't say it quite that way. Okay, so here we see the court essentially having this very, very strong dual federalism position that strips the United States federal government of its ability to legislate about things happening in the territories. And of course, this has important, devastating consequences in as much as it helps to spur on the Civil War. So now to a slightly lighter topic. There comes after the Civil War, we get to the Reconstruction era. And this is where the very strict dual federalism that we saw in the Scott versus Sanford decision falls away, and we move toward a much more cooperative or even perhaps coercive federalism, where the federal government takes on a much stronger role than it had before. And in part, this is due to the addition of amendments to the Constitution, the Reconstruction era amendments, that gave Congress a direct role in keeping tabs on the way that states are doing their own, what had before been their own business. And now, not too long after this, though, we start to see enthusiasm for Reconstruction start to dwindle because it turns out to be really difficult and really hard and uncomfortable. And we see the rise of this very strong sense of laissez-faire economics, and this becomes kind of the name of the game. And during this era, we see a shift again about the role of the federal government away from this cooperative federalism framework back into this dual federalism framework that limits the power of the federal government under the Necessary and Proper Clause. And in part, one of the ways that the court does this is through using the 10th Amendment to limit the commerce power of the Congress. And so, this means that the story of federalism from about the 1890s forward is largely a story about commerce as well as federalism. And so we are going to talk about the Commerce Clause in a week or two, and so your textbook actually skips past most of these cases because we're going to be revisiting them in the context of the Commerce Clause. They do give sort of a rundown of how these Commerce Clause cases sort of track along with the federalism cycles, and so we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a future video. But in the meantime, we do have some non-Commerce Clause cases that are highly relevant to this question of federalism. So if we skip forward, these are happening in parallel mostly with some of those more specifically Commerce Clause cases. And so we'll be able to kind of understand them as being related and sort of happening during the same era. But these cases that we'll talk about for the rest of this video are dealing with other types of disputes about what federalism should look like. And so the first thing we have is about the power of Congress to attach conditions when admitting a new state into the Union. So we're going to talk about Oklahoma, Coyle versus Smith. Now the facts of this case involve the 1906 Enabling Act for Oklahoma to join the United States. Now in this act there were conditions attached. And one of the interesting conditions was that the capital city would have to stay put until at least 1913. And there were some interesting kind of partisan political reasons for this. But Oklahoma joins the Union and then decides it does not want to wait until 1913. And in 1910, passes a law that would move the state capital. We see a wealthy landowner who owns a bunch of land in the current capital city protesting because this landowner is likely to lose a lot of revenue and the value of his holdings would be greatly reduced if this town was no longer the capital of the state. And so he sues. And the legal question in this case is whether Oklahoma must abide by the conditions, but implicitly that is a question about whether Congress had the power to attach those conditions in the first place and to hold the new state to those conditions once that state became a state. The holding was 7-2, And the answer is no. And Justice Lurton writes for the court. And he talks about how the Constitution is based on this idea of a bunch of states coming together under conditions of equal sovereignty, and that things like deciding where a state capital is located are critical to the operation of that state's sovereignty. And so Congress doesn't have this power to coerce states to do Congress's bidding when it comes to questions of internal governments, such as where's your state capital going to be located. There's a dissent, and this is Justices McKenna and Holmes. And interestingly, we have no clue why they dissented. They just said that they dissented and left it at that and didn't write an opinion. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about this anti-commandeering doctrine. Now, the anti-commandeering doctrine is interesting and new, and it isn't necessarily the next phase of the federalism debate, but it is definitely one of the next phases of the federalism debate. What does this mean? I think it depends on who you ask and when, but largely this has to do with whether or not the federal Congress has the power to make states enact particular regulations or otherwise carry out federal law or federal policies. So the path that we take to get to the anti-commandeering doctrine actually comes through some litigation about federal minimum wage laws and whether or not they can apply to state workers. And then the anti-commandeering doctrine arises in cases requiring state governments not just to comply with the federal law, but to actually enforce it or to enact regulations related to this particular law. So the first case of interest here, this one isn't an excerpt in your book, but it is still quite useful to talk about briefly, National League of Cities versus usury. The facts here have to do with the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 and the amendments to that law that required certain state employees to be paid fairly under this law, or so that state governments would be subject to this law in terms of setting rules about what they could get away with paying their employees. And so the legal question here is whether the 10th Amendment prohibits Congress from regulating the labor market for state employees. And the holding here is a 5-4, very close split. And Rehnquist writes for the court, and the answer is yes, the 10th Amendment prohibits this. The argument goes like this. The state has the power to structure its own operations in these areas that are traditional government functions. So the things that make government government, the states have the ability to decide how they're going to manage those things. Now, there were some vociferous dissents here. Justice Brennan, joined by White and Marshall, sort of point out the idea that there doesn't seem to really be anything anywhere in the Constitution that requires this. And he sort of implies that maybe you just made this up because this is a policy position that you like and you wanted to find some sort of constitutional justification to avoid holding states accountable or maybe even to avoid paying employees fairly. A few years later, we get to Garcia versus the San Antonio Metropolitan Transit Authority case. And here you can notice maybe just from the little graphic up there, the layout, that the justices who are in the majority are now on the other side, right? So this tells you a little bit about what's about to happen. The facts of this case are very, very similar to the facts in National League of Cities. There are some small differences here, and part of this has to do with the fact that SAMHSA was also partially funded by federal grants. But largely the question is the same. Does the 10th Amendment prohibit Congress from regulating the labor market of state employees? This is exactly the same question as the last time. And the holding this time is no. And it's a 5-4 decision again, and this time Blackmun writes for the court. And Blackmun essentially has a very practical argument here. And he said, look, this didn't work at all. So we tried this idea, and we were just wrong. It's not tenable, so kind of oops. And the reason that it didn't work is because there wasn't any real guidance in that opinion about how to decide what is a traditional government function and what isn't. Because certainly states don't have the ability to control everything. So how do you determine what is a traditional government function and what's not? Is operating, a bus system, is that a traditional government function? It's hard to say. And so Blackmun just says, look, this doesn't work, so we'll just undo. Now the dissents were, very loud and upset. So the main dissenting opinion here was written by Powell, and the rest of the dissenters joined. And the gist of the argument here is that, hey, we just decided this a few years back. You have to give at least some deference to stare decisis. Now, how much certainly the Supreme Court is not required to abide by its prior decisions. And so the Supreme Court can overrule itself. But the argument is that you should try not to do that because it adds into the system this unpredictability of the law, and when you can, you want to try to keep things consistent. And O'Connor also writes a dissenting opinion, and she focuses on this point that even if this isn't something that is really kind of specified in the Constitution, the commerce power of the federal government has expanded so much that the founders wouldn't even recognize it, and so we had to do something to kind of return the balance and return some semblance of this federal structure. And so this is the kind of the ramp up to what we're talking about now, which is the anti-commandeering doctrine. So those two cases were about whether states could be bound directly by laws passed by the federal government. But now we're going to talk about a slightly different question. So this whole anti-commandeering doctrine starts with New York versus United States in the early 90s. And the facts of this case have to do with an act of Congress that was an attempt to deal with the fact that there was all of this, low-level radioactive waste in the various states, and there were only a few states that actually had sites that could take this waste and store it and deal with it. And so this act of Congress was an attempt to try to get states to do something about the nuclear waste that they had in their own borders. And so there were a couple of different components of this. And one of the one that is most at issue here has to do with take title provision, which meant that states that didn't find a way to deal with the waste in their states would have to actually take title of that waste and be responsible for it. So the legal question here is whether the 10th Amendment prohibits Congress from requiring states to deal with nuclear waste. And the holding here is that yes, it does. So this is a 6-3 decision, and O'Connor writes for the court. And here, she talks about the couple of, the various different provisions here in this law. One of them was an incentive structure, and basically she said, look, if you want to try to bribe states to do something, go for it. If you want to regulate directly something that is not, I guess, in this traditional government area, That's also fine. However, Congress cannot coerce states to regulate in accordance with what the federal government wants. Because her argument is that this is essentially commandeering the state legislatures and making them do the bidding of the federal government. And so this is where we get this phrase anti-commandeering doctrine, the idea that the federal government cannot commandeer the instrumentalities of the state to do the federal government's own bidding. The dissenting opinion here, Justice White writes the dissenting opinion, and he's joined by Blackmun and Stevens, and basically just says, so are we killing cooperative federalism now? I mean, this law was written with the very strong input of the state of New York, who liked this law until they got the benefits from it, and then after that they decided they didn't want a part of it anymore. And so I think one quote that helps to really emphasize White's point here is this one: the ultimate irony of the decision today is that in its formalistically rigid obeisance to federalism, the court gives Congress fewer incentives to defer to the wishes of state officials in achieving local solutions to local problems. So essentially he's saying, look, this makes it even harder to do the things that the states want, right? Instead of forcing the states to just abide by a one-size-fits-all system, this program actually allowed the states to develop their own regulations that were more tailored to their own needs, and the court has now disallowed that. So the next case about the anti-commandeering doctrine is U.S. versus Prince, and this is a few years later. This one has to do with the Brady Bill, which was a gun control measure from the late 90s. The Brady Bill required local chief law enforcement officers to conduct background checks. And this wasn't permanent. This was basically a recognition that the federal government hadn't yet developed the infrastructure to be able to do background checks on everybody. And so while they were working on this infrastructure, this law instructed local law enforcement officials to actually do these background checks. So the legal question here is whether the 10th Amendment prohibits Congress from requiring state law enforcement to conduct background checks for the feds for a little while. The holding here is yes, the 10th Amendment actually does prohibit this. This opinion for the court is written by Scalia. And Scalia, he notes that, of course, the federal government can obligate judges, because that's actually written directly into the Constitution. But he argues that there isn't a similar allowance in the Constitution for the federal government to obligate executives to carry out federal policy. And again, he argues that that to do this would be commandeering state officials to do the work of the federal government. Now, there are quite a few separate opinions here. One of them is from Thomas, and he concurs with everything in the majority opinion and also takes this opportunity to note that, hey, maybe gun control is forbidden by the Second Amendment. Now, the court doesn't actually deal with this question for another decade or so in D.C. versus Heller. And another one of the separate opinions is Justice Stevens, and he writes a dissent, and the other three join him. And he said, well, there might have been a question before about if we were killing cooperative federalism, but now we know for sure that we've killed cooperative federalism. Because this isn't even asking, we're not commandeering a state legislature here, right? It's not, a matter of asking state governments to pass particular laws. This is just simply asking, state law enforcement officers to apply federal law. And then a quote from Stevens here, I think that goes a long way to show, how much disagreement there really is on the court about this anti-commandeering doctrine. Stevens says, there is not a clause, sentence, or paragraph in the entire text of the Constitution of the United States that supports the proposition that a local police officer can ignore a command contained in a statute enacted by Congress pursuant to an express delegation of power enumerated in Article 1. So essentially, he just says, this is not part of the Constitution. There is nowhere in the Constitution that says this. And actually, Justice Souter pipes up as well in dissent and says, hey, also, if you look at the Federalist Papers, they make it quite clear that they do absolutely anticipate local law enforcement to be carrying out federal law. For example, this is one of the reasons why the state executives will swear an oath to the United States Constitution, and the United States employees don't have to do the opposite. Now, this isn't the end of it. We actually have a very recent case having to do with the anti-commandeering doctrine. This is Murphy versus the NCAA in 2018. This case has to do with a law from, I think, the early 90s. And this law has essentially banned professional and amateur sports betting in all but a few states, Nevada included. And it contained in it a loophole for New Jersey where they could allow sports betting provided that they actually enacted the necessary regulation within a year, and they didn't. So in 2011, New Jersey passes a referendum, and in this referendum, they agree to allow sports betting. And there's litigation that follows from this, mainly because the federal law also allows for sporting organizations to sort of raise legal concerns about whether this sports betting, the particular laws, would damage the integrity of their sport. And so the litigation kind of goes forward. There's a second law that's passed, and the litigation continues. So by the time it gets to the Supreme Court, the legal question is this: does the 10th Amendment prohibit Congress from preventing states from repealing state prohibitions on private conduct? So this is a little convoluted, but basically it's asking whether the Congress had the power under the 10th Amendment to keep New Jersey from legalizing sports betting. And I don't know that it's a terrible surprise, but the holding here is a 6-3 decision. You can see, it's mostly the conservatives there, with a couple of additions, including Justice Kagan. The holding is 6-3, and Alito writes for the court. And Alito's rationale goes like this: Congress cannot compel state legislatures to enact and enforce federal programs. And this also means that that the federal government can't keep. I guess the idea is that if New Jersey enacted this new law, it would essentially go against the law that the federal government was trying to get New Jersey to maintain. And so there's a really interesting discussion in this opinion about the history of the anti-commandeering doctrine and its importance. And so, Alito says that this is, he characterizes the anti-commandeering doctrine as very simple and basic, but also notes that nobody seemed to recognize it until the 1990s. And then he says it's really, really important, even though we've just now started doing this. So I do want to go through a couple of the reasons why Alito says that this anti-commandeering doctrine is so important, and then I'm just going to give you some of the dissenting opinions. So the first reason he gives is this idea that we can protect individual liberty, and that the Constitution intends to protect individual liberty by protecting the sovereignty of states. Now, I don't know about you, but I can think of a lot of examples where it is actually the state governments that are very much infringing on individual liberty, and the federal government is the one who has to kind of come in and deal with that and address that. And I think that's reflected in some of the, kind of responses to this idea. Like, how in the world is it possible that, somehow by protecting this type of sovereignty through the anti-commandeering doctrine, how is that actually going to protect individual liberty? It might in this one particular case, in that it would allow people in New Jersey to bet, on college basketball. But as a more general principle, I think this is kind of a relatively weak argument. He also notes that the anti-commandeering doctrine helps to promote political accountability by making it clear who to credit or blame for particular policies. And again, I think the response to this would be, look, I know that the dissenters often said this isn't a very good argument, and this is an argument that Justice O'Connor made in her majority opinion in New York versus United States. And the dissenters kind of say, look, people can figure out who to blame for stuff, right? This anti-commandeering doctrine isn't going to make that much of a difference in terms of helping people identify who's to blame for example, not letting us have sports betting. I think the flip side of that argument might be that people can't figure this out, and the anti-commandeering doctrine is not going to help them figure this out. I think the flip side is that people are just going to blame all the politicians, regardless whether it was the federal government or the state governments or whatever. And I think, taking those two things together kind of, undermines this point a little bit. There's another point that Alito makes that's quite interesting, that the anti-commandeering doctrine can prevent Congress from making states pay the costs of various federal schemes. And I think this might be a kind of more defensible argument, but perhaps there could be another way that we could accomplish this goal without, this really intense sort of a constitutional framework. And finally, Alito argues that this framework is part of the basic structure of the government established under the Constitution. And as I've just sort of hinted, the countering response to this would be that it's not in the Constitution at all. Certainly, you saw some of our dissenters making this argument. There is not a single word in the Constitution that requires this particular kind of result. And so that's kind of where it stands right now. I'm going to post a couple of additional pieces about the anti-commandeering doctrine. You can see some really interesting stuff on SCOTUS blog. On their page, they had a symposium about this NCAA case. And there are a lot of sort of different opinions about the anti-commandeering doctrine, and if it's good, if it makes sense. So definitely check those out if this is something that interests you. And for me, I think that's going to be it for today. This was a long one, but it's the only one for this module. So have a great day, and we'll see you back here later.